Like everything else the United States does under this administration, it has to worry about Iran, and it doesn't want Iran to be very angry, and so it doesn't want Israel to totally destroy one of the proxies of Iran.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. We're continuing our JNS coverage of the war on Israel that was launched by Hamas on October 7th and the surge in anti-Semitism in the United States by speaking with Shoshana Bryen, one of the nation's leading analysts in defense policy and Middle East affairs. But first, I want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find the latest news, including Top Story and other JNS TV content, by going to jns.org or Telegram and subscribing. And now to today's program. After more than 4 months of standing with Israel and supporting its just war on the Hamas terrorists who launched the October 7th massacres, is the Biden administration getting ready to abandon the Jewish state? That's the question Israelis and Americans have been asking ever since the war started. President Joe Biden and his foreign policy team spent nearly 3 years undermining Israel as they pursued a reboot of President Barack Obama's appeasement of Iran. The pivot back to the failed policy of enriching and empowering Tehran spurred a revival of terrorism in the region, culminating in the horrors of October 7th. But to his credit, Biden stood by Israel in the days after the war, supported the goal of eliminating Hamas, and began the resupply of vitally needed arms and ammunition needed to accomplish that goal. But that created an enormous political problem for the president. The intersectional left-wing activist base of the Democratic Party opposes Israel and didn't even wait for it to begin the counteroffensive against Hamas-controlled Gaza to call for a ceasefire and to demand that the United States halt military aid to the Jewish state. Already losing to former President Donald Trump in the polls in his bid for re-election, Biden considers the open revolt against his policy to be a genuine threat to its chances for victory in November. That's led to him and Secretary of State Antony Blinken spending the entire war talking out of both sides of their mouths about the conflict, refusing to cut the aid and still sticking to their support for Israel's right to defend itself, while all the time seeking to delay and hamstring Israel's military operations against Hamas. In recent weeks, that's taken the form of trying to stop the Israel Defense Forces from completing the job of defeating Hamas in their last strongholds in Gaza, particularly in Rafah city. They are pushing for a ceasefire that would allow the terrorists to emerge from the war still alive and in control of part of the territory that they ran as an independent Palestinian state in all but name before October 6th. And though they have threatened to veto a resolution forcing an immediate ceasefire at the UN Security Council, they are proposing their own version, which demands one as soon as practical. Just as bad, they are insisting that the end of the war must be followed by a diplomatic push for a Palestinian state that would reward Hamas for its atrocities and put all of Israel in danger of even worse horror should it actually come to pass. Israeli officials I spoke to while there the last 2 weeks admit to being worried, but say they will hold their tongues about the way Washington is undermining them so long as the flow of arms continues and there is no ceasefire imposed on them. But even those who are most sanguine about Biden's pro-Israel credentials have to be wondering about how long a president who seems more worried about criticisms from anti-Semites than from those who support Israel will stick even to this two-faced approach to the war. If Biden's advocacy for a ceasefire and a Palestinian state are just empty talk, that is something Israel can tolerate. But as he feels the heat from his left-wing allies, it's not clear at what point will a betrayal of Israel be the mark of this appalling display of weak leadership by President Biden. What Americans fail to see is that if Israel isn't allowed to win the war, Hamas will emerge as the victor, something with unknowable and horrendous consequences, not just for Israel, but also for American interests. To discuss the state of the U.S.-Israel relationship, efforts to increase aid to the Jewish state, and much else, we're pleased to have with us today one of the most insightful thinkers on these subjects. Shoshana Bryen is Senior Director of the Jewish Policy Center and editor of In Focus Quarterly. She is the former Executive Director and Senior Director for Security Policy at GINSA. She has worked with the Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army War College and the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, and lectured at the National Defense University in Washington. She runs a webinar series for the Jewish Policy Center, and her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, the Daily Caller, and JNS, among other outlets. Shoshana Bryen, welcome back to Top Story.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's nice to be here.
Well, Shoshana, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you to take the temperature of the U.S.-Israel alliance at this moment. Most importantly, do you think the Biden administration's policy of essentially talking out of both sides of its mouth about the war against Hamas is sustainable? And if, as perhaps some suspect, we're on the cusp of the point where it will change to one of open opposition to Israel's winning the war?
The temperature's about 33 degrees. It's not deep freeze. It's not warm. You don't want to be in it. Yes, the U.S. government is playing both sides, and it's not because the U.S. government likes Hamas. I mean, the president's made it quite clear that Hamas is the enemy of Israel, Hamas is the enemy of the United States. But like everything else the United States does under this administration, it has to worry about Iran, and it doesn't want Iran to be very angry. I mean, Iran's always angry. Iran's always pushing. Iran's always looking for a way to get around. But the administration is trying to keep Iran reasonably happy. And so it doesn't want Israel to totally destroy one of the proxies of Iran.
That's, a fascinating point of view, and provides a pretty good explanation. I'll have to admit that I've been focusing more on the politics, which is certainly applying a lot of heat to the administration. Now, of course, there's no denying that Biden and his team have been supportive of Israel since October 7th, but it's equally true that they have political reasons for ending this war, regardless of the consequences for the region. What do you think matters the most to Biden and Secretary of State Blinken? Eliminating Hamas, toppling the Netanyahu government, or winning back the affections of the Democratic Party's intersectional left-wing base? And I guess I should add, and keeping Iran happy, or do they honestly think that they can accomplish all of these objectives?
I have to say, and I don't do Israeli politics a lot, I don't think toppling Netanyahu is right now the priority. Look, in Israel, after every major security incident, there is a commission, and their commissions are very serious. Unlike a House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing, their commissions are serious and people lose their jobs. People are already anticipating the commission. They had one after the 73 war. They had one after the Lebanon war in 2006. People are already anticipating that the commission will take out a lot of heads, and one of those heads could very, very well be that of the prime minister. So I don't think that's the primary issue right now for the Biden administration. The administration's issue, and it's not saving Hamas either, except to the extent that Hamas belongs, to Iran. The president's problem right now is that he has a clear issue as he looks at re-election. All the things that he has promoted have gone south. The border thing is costing him with Democratic voters, specifically African-American Democratic voters. The Israel thing is costing him with Arab voters, and Arab voters tend to be in Michigan, swing state, places that he needs them to be. So you see a lot of things that are designed to harass Israel and thus signal to Arab American voters or people who support Arab countries or support the Palestinians, that he is on their side. And you see that actually in the last two things that he did, which people didn't pay a lot of attention to. First is he put an executive order on 4 Israelis. And he said those people were responsible for harassing or harming or somehow doing damage to Palestinians in Judea and Samaria. The 4 are themselves relatively unimportant people. However, it's a signal that if you don't do what I want, I have this thing called an executive order, and I may use it next time against, I don't know, your ambassador to the United Nations. Perhaps he won't be able to come and harass people at the UN. Or perhaps I'll use it against your foreign minister. So it's a threat in being. It was an ugly thing to do because Israelis are being separate from October 7th. Israelis have been killed in large numbers on the West Bank in 2023. So it's a way of saying I have leverage. The other thing he did, and really nobody's paid attention to this, is he said you shouldn't bring foreign workers into Israel. The recruitment of foreign workers, which happens a lot in India, happens in Thailand. It'll happen less in Thailand because the Thais were affected by October 7th. You shouldn't bring those foreign workers in. You should hire Palestinians because we are concerned that if you bring foreign workers in, you may violate their human rights. And we are concerned that the poor workers that you bring in may suffer because so you should do Palestinians. This is extraordinarily ugly. Qatar, with whom we work and with whom the United States, and with whom we appear to have an excellent relationship, God knows why, has slaves. And I mean slaves. When they bring in workers, they take their passports, they house them the way they want, they don't let them leave, slaves. We have not said a word to Qatar, but Israel should have Palestinian workers, not Indian workers. The Indian workers, by the way, have been signing up in large numbers. So these are things that tell Israel, I can hurt you.
Yeah, I think that's clearly true. Now, of course, during his first 3 years in office, the Biden team concentrated on failed efforts to appease Iran and largely ignored the peace process with the Palestinians that even most of them conceded had no chance of success. They had been paying attention to everything that happened when most of these people were working for Obama. But since October 7th, they've revived their advocacy for a two-state solution that the Palestinians have shown consistently they have no interest in, and even tried to involve the Saudis in a scheme to force Israel to accept this. Granted that Biden, Blinken, and the rest of the Obama alumni club that currently control U.S. foreign policy have always believed in a two-state solution as a matter of religious faith almost, but do they still really believe in it, despite all the proof to the contrary that shows that it's not only unrealistic, but actually dangerous to the interests of the U.S. as well as Israel?
Yes, they believe in it. They absolutely believe in it. There's a cadre of people who signed on to it more than 30 years ago. They've made their career on it. And by the way, it's not true that they gave up the two-state solution in the first couple of years of the Biden administration. Every time Antony Blinken was asked about the Middle East, he talked about Palestinian aspirations for a state. Palestinian aspirations are not for a state. They are to remove the state of Israel, which is why you never get a clear answer from Palestinians about what they would accept to have a serious conversation with Israel. They claim they want the right of return. Now, the right of return is a simple impossibility. That's it. It's impossible. President Clinton understood that many years ago. But it's a way of saying, no, we're not having a conversation. We're not having a conversation about Israel. And Blinken accepts that. They're not having a conversation. But if you admit after all this time that it was based on a faulty premise, where do you go? And it's not just Blinken. It's a lot of people in the State Department. It's the Tom Friedmans. It's the Dennis Rosses. It's the Kurtzers and Millers. It's the Martin Indyks. There's a whole cadre of people whose career was made on this. And they still believe it. And if they don't believe it, they believe it enough to want to pursue it so that they don't look bad. The fact is they look bad every single day.
Yeah, well, of course, there's an enormous disconnect with Israelis on that, certainly right now. I mean, I think support for a two-state solution died when Oslo died in the Second Intifada. But I think since October 7th, I've just come back from a couple of weeks in Israel, and I spoke to left-wingers there that I know, and even they aren't pushing for it anymore, other than maybe a few extremists in the staff of Haaretz. There is no interest in Israel for a two-state solution, in large measure because, Gaza was an independent Palestinian state in all but name from 2007 till October 7th. And Israel saw what happened. I mean, it saw what happened. There was a consensus in Israel, not just Netanyahu, but his opponents as well, as leaving Hamas in control of Gaza, paying them off even. How that could be not only reinstated, but then replicated, in Judea Samaria, the West Bank, that strikes most Israelis, overwhelming majority of Israelis, as not just ill-advised, but insane. How does the administration really think that they can use its leverage, whether it's sanctions or aid, to force Israel to do this?
Do they think? I don't know what they think. You don't know what they think. Nobody knows what they think. What you do know is that they continually advocate something that Israel tells them is not possible. And Israel's been telling them this for a long time. Even in the short period of Yair Lapid's prime ministership, a two-state solution was not possible because there are 4 states that you have to account for. You have to account for Jordan. You have to account for Judea and Samaria, Israel, and Gaza. You have 4 governments in those states. How you reconcile those 4, and any 2 of them are at war at any given moment. You forget that the 2 ends of the Palestinian state are separated not only by space, but by politics, by the military. Israel's operations in Judea and Samaria last summer, in Jenin and in other places, were to get rid of Hamas in the West Bank, on the grounds that, bad as it is, the Palestinian Authority is better than Hamas. So you didn't want to lose Mahmoud Abbas to Hamas, and that's why the Israelis did Jenin. Abbas screamed about it, but you notice he didn't fight them, ever, under any circumstances. So now so Israel understood this. Israel understood the problem of Hamas versus Fatah. The United States says, look, we're just going to take Fatah and we're going to move it to the Gaza Strip and we're going to let them run both sides. That was the story of the 2007 Gaza Civil War. They threw people off buildings. They dragged them through the streets behind cars. They killed a lot of people, Hamas did, to get rid of the Palestinian Authority. And they managed. They got rid of it. People talk about Palestinians voted for Hamas. Not really. They voted for them in a legislative election. They didn't vote for them to be their governing power. They're the governing power because they won the Civil War in 2007. And they're still ready to fight that Civil War unless Israel does something about it. So the idea that you could just move the Palestinian Authority over to Gaza and let them run both is outrageous. It's outrageous. It has no relation to reality. And then you still have to deal with Jordan.
Yeah, exactly, which has its own talking out, publicly, it's a great advocate for the Palestinian national movement. Privately, they're scared to death of an independent Palestinian state, which the king rightly views as a threat to his authoritarian rule over Jordan.
But go back to the center. The king is also terrified of Iran. Iran wants Jordan because that would complete the encirclement of Israel. Now they have Iraq, but you still have Jordan. And they have been pushing the Jordanians, and we have been ignoring it. The king of Jordan does not ignore it. He's got to deal with it.
Yeah, but let's shift our focus slightly to the north of Israel. And while the world has focused on Gaza, the threat to Israel from Hezbollah and Lebanon looms large for Israelis, not least because, along with the hundreds of thousands that are in hotels because they've had to flee their homes in the south, tens of thousands have fled their homes in the north. How would you evaluate the Biden administration's efforts to deal with this problem?
What efforts? What efforts? France took the lead. France still sees itself as a colonial power in Lebanon, and France took the lead in trying to have negotiations with Hezbollah to move back behind the Litani River, as it was required to do by UN Security Council Resolution 1701. So 1701 passes, and Hezbollah is supposed to be behind the river, and the only weapons in the south of Lebanon are supposed to be those of the Lebanese armed forces, which the United States arms and trains. Nobody ever paid attention to 1701. Hezbollah dug itself in. I met with UNIFIL people, the UN forces there, within 5 or 6 years of the passage of 1701. And they knew perfectly well that Hezbollah was integrating itself into the south. Now, France goes back and says, look, you got to take all that stuff out and you have to move it. And Hezbollah says, what are you, nuts? We spent all these years putting it in. We're not taking it out. And they're not. The U.S. has said very little. We sent Amos Hochstein there. He's the guy who nailed the maritime border deal with Hezbollah and with Lebanon and with Israel. They're 3 separate deals, by the way, because Lebanon wouldn't sign a deal that Israel signed. If there was an Israeli signature, you weren't going to get a Lebanese signature. But what that deal did was say to Hezbollah, if you don't attack Israel's natural gas resources in the Mediterranean, you can get the money from that deal. So we were paying them off from the beginning. We are still paying them off. And we pay them off again because Hezbollah belongs to Iran. Yeah. It's a wholly owned subsidiary. This has nothing to do with Lebanese people, not Christians, not Muslims, not anybody. This is an implant by Iran. So Israel, not wanting to attack Lebanon full force, has been eliminating Hezbollah commanders in Lebanon, and that's a very important and useful thing.
Yeah. Now, the question of, what has deterred Hezbollah from joining Hamas in this war is an interesting one, I suppose, especially for Hamas, which is probably disappointed. There are a lot of theories about this, whether Iran considers, Hezbollah its insurance policy against an attack on its own territory and its nuclear program. The Biden administration and its apologists, would say that the moving of the aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean helped deter Iran and Hezbollah. What's your take on that?
All of the above. All of the above. Yes, Hezbollah was very disappointed. Hamas was very disappointed. They, first of all, expected Hezbollah rockets, and they secondly expected a much larger intifada-style movement of Palestinians from the West Bank into Israel. They were disappointed on all levels. They hadn't really thought about the Houthis. Yes, Iran is trying to hold Hezbollah in abeyance. It is the only strike-back capability that we know Iran has if there's a major attack on Iran by Israel. So you will have Hezbollah. If Israel goes in and does to Hezbollah what it could do, doesn't want to do, but what it could do, Iran loses that. But thirdly, Iran has to be a little bit concerned about what the U.S. might do. And that's why Iran has recently told its Iraqi militia friends, and it has told Hezbollah, and it has told the Houthis, cut back a little bit, guys, because we want to make sure that President Biden has a way to step back from his kind of more aggressive posture of the last month. The Houthis are not doing it. The Houthis are out there. They sunk a British ship. The crew had fortunately got away, but they sunk a British ship. That was not on the Iranian agenda. So the Iranians have a lot of things to worry about. Hezbollah has an awful lot to worry about. They see themselves as, I don't want to say the occupiers of Lebanon, the kind of colonialists of Lebanon. They use it for money. They use it for weapons training. They use it for smuggling. They use it to live in. It's a nice country, or at least it was a nice country once. So they don't want to get moved out. And so we'll see.
Yeah, that's...
But Israel has been very clear, I have to say. Israel has been very clear. This is a two-front war. We're big on the southern front right now, which is Gaza, but the northern front is going to have to be taken care of because you can't have Israeli civilians living like this.
Yeah, that's absolutely... I heard that over and over again, that the current situation is unsustainable, with the only caveat being, one war at a time, as long as they're fully engaged with Hamas. Israel doesn't need a second front. But if and when Hamas is dealt with, then Hezbollah is going to have to either accommodate Israel by stopping, its firing on the north, or perhaps face the consequences. Although, again, that is not something that, you started off talking about how Biden doesn't want to anger Iran. Clearly, Biden would be willing to use all of his leverage to stop Israel from taking out Hezbollah.
Yes, it will. But again, I think the Israelis have come to a point. I was going to ask you, you found leftists in Israel? I think Israel has come to a point where there aren't really leftists left. There are people who understand that Israel is extremely vulnerable, despite how good the IDF is, and the IDF is very good. They are vulnerable. And you can't just sit there and say, if we pay them off, maybe they won't hurt us. We've learned that lesson.
Yeah, I think that seems to be a learnred lesson.
I think
Obviously,
for Israel, it's a learned lesson.
Not
for us.
How it plays out in Israeli politics, and we'll see. But you raised the question of the Houthis, who, were involved in a sort of life and death war with the Saudis during the Trump administration. But that was one of the things that Biden and the Democrats were most interested in when they took power in 2021, which was ending what they considered to be an evil war waged by the Saudis, that obviously empowered the Houthis and put them in a position to be a threat to the sea lanes. After all, which is the freedom of navigation of the sea lanes is why the United States has a navy in the first place, dating back more than 200 years. So what is there have been some sort of tentative moves to punish the Houthis. It doesn't seem to have done much damage to them. Can President Biden actually do anything about this in his current, the way he's currently set up?
It's not clear. He has taken out, our military has taken out drones, but drones are launched from mobile sites, and so it's very hard to go back after them. And if you wanted to say to yourself, yes, I'm going to punish the Houthi government, those people are moles. They live underground. You can't punish them. There's nowhere for you to go to engage in a war with them. So you have to get their sponsors to stop sponsoring. And that would be, again, Iran. But here's an interesting side story to that story. Israel's Abraham Accords partners have not said a whole lot in this war. They have not broken their relations with Israel. They've not threatened to break relations with Israel. In fact, they say the opposite. But as a practical matter, the Suez Canal is now seeing about 75% less traffic than it does at a normal time. Now, that means one of two things has to happen. Either you have to go all the way around the outside, or you have to find a land route for some of your exports. And the UAE and Saudi Arabia have long considered a rail line into Israel that would ultimately take their products, not all of their products, but certain things, could be shipped overland through Israel and out the port of Ashdod or out the port of Haifa. And that's one of the things the Abraham Accords countries had been discussing, how to create other avenues. And the UAE has ramped up the construction of the rail and overland route because they see it as important to them. And as long as they do, the Abraham Accords will live. And so it's an important thing. They're working it. Now, by the way, it gives you another odd, and I'm not an optimist. I'm never an optimist. It's not in my soul. But here's an optimistic thought for you. Israel finishes the war against the Hamas government, and Hamas no longer rules. And people keep wanting to say, what happens the day after? I don't know what happens the day after. We occupied Germany and Japan for quite a long time after World War II before we got to the actual day after. So I don't know. But consider the possibility that Abraham Accords countries, specifically the UAE and Saudi, who are culturally reasonably close to Palestinians, who speak the same language, who have money, who are entrepreneurial, who have capabilities, and who covet a port on the Mediterranean, could be very helpful in the reconstruction of Gaza. And whatever happens in the day after, Israel's not going to want to occupy Gaza by itself. Security control is one thing, and Israel, in my opinion, will maintain security control. But the reconstruction and the re-education and the reorientation of the people of Gaza, which is going to have to happen, just the way it happened in Germany and Japan, that might be best done in the company of the Abraham Accords countries.
Do you think
Maybe.
they'll really do that? I mean,
I don't know.
considering, the pressure, I mean, there's always been this dichotomy between Arab rulers who are pragmatic, whether you're talking about Jordan or Egypt or, the Gulf states, and sort of the Arab street to the extent that we know what that means. But clearly, anti-Israel sentiment, anti-Semitism is very strong within the Arab world and has been hyped up and encouraged by the October 7th massacres and the war with Hamas. That's the question about the future of the Abraham Accords. Can they survive with this increased, hostility?
That is the question. That's always been the question. Until October 7th, I think the answer to the question was clearly, yes, they could survive. The UAE saw no major backlash. Bahrain saw none. Morocco likes Jews. Morocco likes Israelis. I think it was pretty clear that the Abraham Accords made sense for the people who wanted to give their people a better way of life. So there's your real question. Who wants to give people a better way of life? The Abraham Accords came out of the failure of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was not what the Bush administration said it was. It was not the longing for democracy. It was not looking for voting.
Yeah, Obama, right? Yeah.
No, Obama and Bush as well.
Yeah.
Said it later. Condoleezza Rice, for whom I have great respect, said democracy was the yearning of every human heart. No, it wasn't. Bush did it in Iraq. Obama did it in primarily in North Africa. But it was all the same thing. It was that people wanted a better way to live, they said. And they said the better way to live is under a democratic government. No, it isn't. Not necessarily. Lots of different kinds of governments can work. What those people were looking for was an end to corruption being endemic in the Arab world, and money for themselves. They wanted to live. They wanted to have a future. People have tried to leave Gaza now for years, young people, to get a good job in another place because they know there's no good job in Gaza. You have to spend $20,000 to get a visa to get out of Egypt. Where is a 20-year-old Gazan young man going to get $20,000, then go to Europe, then make money, then be able to marry his girlfriend? It was impossible. But now you see what can happen when people accept the theory that what you want to do is create a place where people can work and live and make money and not have it stolen from them by other people. So I don't know. Nobody knows what the day after will look like. You can take the pessimistic view and say it's just going to be one long morass. Or you can take the optimistic view and say Bahrain is a better model. UAE is a better model.
Well, that's certainly a viable argument. We'll see how it plays out. But as long as
plays out means the U.S. government has to support it.
Yes,
among other things.
That is the key there. But as long as we're on the Abraham Accords, let me ask you about the position of the Saudis. There has, that has been sort of the ultimate goal for Netanyahu and his government to get them to, normalize relations. Now, the Biden administration is sort of dangling that for the Israelis as part of their effort to secure a Palestinian state. Meanwhile, there have always been people who have been skeptical about the Saudis' willingness to go all the way towards normalization, thinking that given their position as the guardians of the Islamic holy places, that might be a bridge too far for them, and that the fact that they like relations with Israel, which are quite close, in terms of security and other issues that matter to them, but didn't want to take the risk of going further. Where do you see that playing out? Who's right there?
Everybody's right. Everybody's right because everybody moves according to their own requirements. The Saudis do not want full relations with Israel at the price of a Palestinian state. They don't want a Palestinian state. One of the oddest things is Saudi Arabia is threatened by Iran precisely because it's the guardian of the mosques in Mecca and Medina. So it needs Israel for security. But it has led to certain Saudi thinkers saying, well, listen, what if we could get Saudi control of the mosque in Jerusalem? What if we change the waqf from people who are Jordanians who are threatened by Iran and Palestinians who we don't like anyway, and we could be the rulers of all three mosques through the waqf, and we could deal with Israel. We can deal with Israel. A number of Saudi scholars have said, you can find them on YouTube, that the Quran says that the Jews are our brothers and their city is Jerusalem. You can find a deal in there if you look. Will it happen? No, I don't think so. Certainly not for a while. But it could happen. And I have to say that Saudi Arabia has undergone a major transformation internally. My own rabbi, who believes that Mount Sinai is in the northern part of Arabia. There are 3 sites in the Middle East that scholars think could be Mount Sinai. We're never sure. My rabbi chose the one that's in Arabia. And so he took a delegation, a pilgrimage, to northern Arabia. He was welcomed by the Saudis. No problems. Not only was he welcomed and things were made easy for them, but they found a hotel near the site that hadn't opened yet. So they had a kosher kitchen. That is not something you would have expected the Saudis to figure out for a Jewish delegation who wants to come. And the rabbi wanted to write a page for the Torah he was writing. That is not something I would have expected 10 years ago. So I think the Saudis, and someone else was in Saudi Arabia, and he went to the Saudi National Museum. And you know who's not in the Saudi National Museum? The Wahhabis. They've been written out. So for all the mess they made and all the damage they did, they're out. All of this is to say the world changes in good ways and bad ways. I don't know where Saudi Arabia is going, but I see evidence that there could be some good ways. Will it result in full relations? I don't know. The king of Saudi Arabia does not want full relations with Israel until there's a Palestinian state. He is on that page. And the crown prince will have some trouble just saying to his father, no.
Yeah, well, that is an obstacle, and that is the conundrum there.
But it's okay.
Yeah.
Isn't it better to have operating relations than an ambassador?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it should be Israel's point of view anyway. It should be the United States' view as well. Let's switch gears for a moment and talk about what's going on in Washington. Congress has been paralyzed, more or less, in recent months by the debate over foreign aid. After the Biden administration proposed a bill that tied additional aid to Israel to a far larger allocation to Ukraine, as well as assistance to Palestinians and other causes. Meanwhile, congressional Republicans demanded that Biden do something about the catastrophe at the U.S. southern border before they would allocate more funds abroad. Israel's cause thus has been mired in this standoff between supporters and opponents of a serious attempt to defend America's borders, as well as the debate over Ukraine. Is it a mistake, do you think, for supporters of Israel to acquiesce to these political maneuvers, or they just hope, they're just caught in between because Israel is now sort of a weapon against Biden's critics on illegal immigration in Ukraine, all the while the Republicans who proposed the clean bill on Israel are not really interested in one with Ukraine? How does where is this going?
Yeah, the Biden administration has a lot of trouble on 2 issues. One is the border and one is Ukraine. Americans do not want their money to go to Ukraine. Years ago, when this started, I strongly suggested an inspector general. I'm not opposed to money for Ukraine as a principle, but we needed an inspector general, and we needed inspectors in Ukraine to understand where the money was going so that it was spent properly. Remember the difference between Ukraine money and Israel money. Most Israel money is spent in the United States. It's spent on joint defense interests. It's basically a subsidy to the U.S. defense industry. It works out very well for Israel, and it works out very well for the United States. And you know where the money's going. Okay? So it's not ever a problem. The $14 billion for Israel, the Republicans added another $5 billion for air defenses. Again, that money's going to be spent in the U.S. Ukraine money is a large hose that runs out in Ukraine, and we don't know where it goes. And it's not unreasonable for people to say, I don't want to do that without an inspector. But Biden said to himself, hey, everybody's for Israel aid, except, a couple people are not. But basically everybody's for Israel aid. Basically, nobody's for Ukraine aid. Stick them together. And then maybe we'll throw in a few bucks for the border. It's a terrible idea, as are most of their ideas. Those things should be looked at separately. And the humanitarian aid, again, the humanitarian aid's about $8 billion. And it's in there in the Israel section because you can't give it directly to UNRWA, and you can't give it directly to anybody else. So they put it in the Israel section, and they said it's going to be administered not by UNRWA, but by USAID. USAID is run by Samantha Power, who really doesn't like Israel, who won't talk to Israeli government officials, and her best friends are UNRWA. So,
and who was recently, I might add, was recently part of a delegation sent to Dearborn, Michigan by the Biden administration,
yes.
in which John Feiner, the number 2 person at the National Security Council, went with Powers to basically bend the knee to the mayor of Dearborn, who wouldn't take a meeting with Biden's campaign manager to get his support for the Biden campaign. So, that just puts that in a little bit of context.
Yes, and Rashida Tlaib announced yesterday that Arab Americans or supporters of the Palestinians should not consider voting Democrat this year. I think they're a little bit confused because what are they going to vote for? Republicans? They're going to vote for Donald Trump. They're going to vote for Nikki Haley, 2 people who have different views of the Palestinians perhaps than they do. So I don't know what they're thinking, but I know what Biden's thinking. He's thinking he needs to bribe them with something. So there it is for you. But as far as the Ukraine thing, I just think it's appalling that you take 3 things that are not related and you make them related only for political reasons. The border needs to be solved as a border issue, and they better hurry up. Israel is an Israel issue, and Ukraine is a disaster. So those 3 things should never have been attached. And the Jewish community, by the way, should not agree to this. They shouldn't.
And yet many of them are. Indeed, you hear from a lot of, I would say, many normally very sensible people when it comes to foreign policy, basically saying, trying to simplify the world, in a new axis of evil, saying, China, Russia, and Iran are the enemy. The cause of Ukraine is the cause of Israel. Now, certainly Russia's invasion of Ukraine was brutal and illegal, and one can certainly sympathize with Ukraine's efforts to defend its independence. Whether or not one sympathizes with their efforts to continue this war to get back to the land that they lost in 2014 is another issue. But what do you think of this widespread acceptance, including among a lot of people who are steadfast supporters of Israel, that the cause of Ukraine and the causes of Israel are all the same thing?
I think it's a mistake. And I think they're willing to do it because out of very good pro-Israel reasons. We need the money for Israel, they say. And so, okay, fine, we're going to bring on the cause of Ukraine. It is a democracy. It was invaded by Putin. It was invaded by the Russians. But it shows an enormous lack of understanding about what's going on in Ukraine and what the circumstances of Ukraine look like. Also, the unwillingness of the Ukrainians to have a negotiation. I mean, you have to say the Ukrainians are pushing this war way beyond where it should have gone. So I think it's fair for the pro-Israel side to say they are not the same issue. We can support Ukraine for this, for certain circumstances, for certain things, but Israel is a separate issue.
Yeah. Now, the leverage that the U.S. holds over Israel because of its dependence on American arms and ammunition has become a real problem since October 7th. But even those Israelis that I talked to who are most concerned about it concede it would take many years to do even a little something about it. And of course, they can't, they're not going to start manufacturing, their own planes. That boat sailed a long time ago. They can manufacture more of their own arms and more, smaller arms and ammunition, missiles. But do you think Israel should seek to end its dependence on U.S. arms, at least partially?
They've already started to look at what they can do. And it's not for me to say, really. The Israelis need certain things that the U.S. has. The U.S. needs certain things that Israel has. If you listen to people like the CENTCOM commander, General Eric Kurilla, they're meant to be together. They are just meant to be together. And I think most military people think that that's true. So the American military doesn't want Israel to go away. And they don't want them to start producing their own stuff. And so we have an election coming in a certain number of months, and we have to ask ourselves the question, are we going to change in November of 2024? Is this a temporary problem? If you see this problem as temporary, then maybe you just say, I'm going to hold my breath and hope Israel gets through it. and we'll see what we get with the next Congress and the next president. So I don't think you can answer the question. And Biden, by the way, has approved shipments of things that Israel needs. So even since October 7th, he's approved a lot of things that they've asked for and a lot of things they need. Periodically, we have presidents who don't want to. Obama held up the shipments of planes to Israel because he said they were being used indiscriminately, but they were the planes that had a much greater, they were much more precise. They were actually the planes that were much more precise. So he, by not being a military, not by asking his military, made it harder for Israel to be precise and protect the people the U.S. wants to protect. Biden has been letting the Israelis say, this is what I need, and he has basically shipped them. Let's keep going.
Yeah, well, let's hope that continues. You're someone who spent your career helping to promote greater cooperation between the U.S. and Israeli militaries, and there's no question that the ties between the IDF and the U.S. armed forces are intense and close. But sort of, stepping back a little, can military cooperation of that sort survive in a Washington which is increasingly dominated by sort of intersectional and woke ideology that is transforming the U.S. military as well as American politics? How does that go forward if the U.S. military really is changing?
The U.S. military is changing. Again, I say this could be a temporary problem. And the reason it could be a temporary problem, regardless of who wins the next election, is what it's done is driven down the enlistments to the U.S. military. So if they thought that by opening the military to gay or trans or openly sexually different people, and then they would come and they would sign up and they would join our military. It hasn't happened because that was not a community that was going to join the military anyway. But what it did is discourage people from the communities who normally sign up to serve. And now you have real problems, except in the Marine Corps, with recruitment. The Marines are the only service meeting their recruitment goals, and the Marines are the only ones who are not doing this. They're just not doing it. But I look at families, my own daughter and her husband were career military. They're now retired, and they have kids. Their boys are 14. And they always assumed that the boys, and perhaps the girls as well, would join the military. She looks at me now and she says, if my sons wanted to join the military today, I would say no. So the result of these changes has been to drive off one community of people without picking up another community. And it may be that the military has to go back on those decisions, regardless of who's president.
Well, I would certainly hope so.
One would hope so.
Yeah. Taking a broader view of these issues, and the whole question of the U.S.-Israel relationship, how much of a role do you think anti-Semitism, especially the alarming increase in Jew hatred from the left, rooted in intersectional and critical race theory myths, is having in influencing U.S. foreign defense policy?
It's hard to tell. Clearly, there's been a huge upswing in anti-Semitism from the left. There's always been some on the right. There's always been some on the left. But this is a big leap on the left. We should have seen it coming because, and by the way, there was a book by George Gilder called The Israel Test that did see it coming back in 2009 when he wrote it, that intersectionalists had no room for Jews. Jews as individuals, yes, because they brought money to the cause and they brought respectability to the cause. But Jews as an intersectional group, no. And how this came to be. And, it's worth looking at George Gilder, who saw it more than a decade ago. But in the broader United States of America, legitimate polling organizations tell you that by vast margins, the American people believe that Israel is our friend and ally, and they would like to see Hamas destroyed. So I don't know how much of this yet, we will see. I don't know how much of this yet is the people with the biggest bullhorn and the people most able to put people in the streets. They closed down a major highway in San Francisco today. People are not happy with them, even in San Francisco. They're not happy with those people. So I don't know where it's going. Right now, the big bullhorns and the loudest voices are the ones that are winning. Do they win in the long term? I don't know. depends on what the rest of us do.
Yeah, as opposed to the New York Times editorial board.
To the New York Times editorial.
And the Washington Post, I should add.
You don't pay for them, do you?
As some readers sometimes say to me, you read them, so I don't have to. So
okay, I accept that. It's something you do for your people.
Right.
It's all right.
It's part of my job.
Okay.
As you just said, despite the dangers to the alliance, polls continue to show that most Americans still support Israel. Are you optimistic that this will survive and the woke anti-Semitic left won't complete its capture of the Democratic Party, which essentially is on the way to making Israel a partisan rather than a bipartisan concern?
Yes, I worry about that. I'm not sure. Again, it's going to play out in the elections. I don't know. I have this great fear that the left will drag centrist leftists to the left, centrist Democrats, to the left, that Israel will just, if not become a pariah, just become a non-issue. We don't want to talk about Israel. We're not going to vote for it. We don't want to talk about it. And that would be very, very damaging. On the other hand, as I say, I think the vast body of the American people is really tired of a lot of things that they're seeing in this country right now. And that's not only the woke left. It is also the border. It is also inflation. People seem to have this thought that if inflation is lowered, then the prices go down. That's what the administration is telling you. Hey, inflation's only 3.1%. It was 17%. The prices are still going up.
Right.
So people are seeing what Biden said doesn't exist. And that's a terrible disconnect for voters. Biden says, hey, the economy's great. Voter says, I'm paying $3.45 for gas. So I think a lot of things will change. Now, I don't want to say it only in the partisan sense. I mean, the Republicans can certainly mess this up between now and November. But the people are looking around and going, wait a minute, this is not good. The border's not good. The crime is not good. The inflation is not good. The sexualization of our children in our schools and in the military and in every place else, it's not good. Anthony Blinken told the State Department, he put out a memo, like he has nothing else to do, to the State Department about pronouns. He wants to be sure everybody's using appropriate pronouns. And if you make a mistake, please apologize, and apologize nicely, he said. He's got bigger fish to fry, but he doesn't know it.
Yeah, well, that's certainly true. Well, we'll be following all of this for the rest of the year and beyond. Shoshana, thanks so much for joining us today, for your work on behalf of the U.S.-Israel Alliance and the insights that you shared with us.
Jonathan, it's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you. And we also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself. And we'll see you again next week.